What if everything you've been told about progress, freedom, and the modern world is a beautiful lie? What if the collapse you're witnessing isn't chaos, but transformation? See, no empire falls by accident. No belief system disappears without a replacement waiting in the shadows. We're not just watching a cultural shift. We're living through the end of an entire age. And this isn't just history. It's prophecy. Carl Jung called it Aion, a psychological and spiritual mutation that unfolds across millennia, encoded in our symbols, religions, and subconscious dreams. We've left the age of Pisces behind, an era defined by faith, sacrifice, and the inner world, and stepped blindly into Aquarius, where knowledge replaces wisdom and information drowns meaning. The old gods are dying, but the new ones? They wear lab coats, run corporations, and whisper through algorithms. They promise freedom, but sell dependency. They promise truth, but demand obedience. You're not crazy for feeling lost. It's the signature of every age of transition. But here's the twist. The Antichrist doesn't come to destroy. He comes to fulfill the dream of man without God. In this video, we'll break through the illusion. We'll trace the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of Christianity, the betrayal of its spirit, and the emergence of secular ideologies pretending to be salvation. We'll explore how materialism, Marxism, and even science itself have become the new altars, while the soul has been exiled. And most of all, we'll uncover what's next. Because if you know how to read the signs, not just in politics, but in prophecy, you'll see the choice before us isn't about left or right. It's about light or darkness. Chapter 1. The Transition of Orders. History isn't just a collection of dusty events. It's the ever-turning wheel of power, belief, and human longing. The Roman Empire wasn't simply a political machine. It was the embodiment of a worldview, an ideology rooted in control, hierarchy, and conquest. It defined what it meant to be a citizen, a man, a ruler. But no empire lasts forever. Beneath the surface of marble palaces and military discipline, something was shifting, a crack forming in the material logic that once held the world together. That crack would become a chasm, swallowing old gods and birthing a new order. The rise of Christianity wasn't just spiritual, it was revolutionary. It shattered the old empire's narrative, offering a radically different axis of meaning. Instead of military valor, it honored meekness. Instead of Caesar's decree, it whispered of a higher kingdom. This wasn't just religion. It was a complete psychological rewiring of the Western mind. Rome's collapse wasn't simply political. It was the spiritual exhaustion of an order whose ideology could no longer sustain its people's soul. A society built on brute force had run out of fuel. And yet, every death conceals a birth. The Christian worldview, with its emphasis on logos and transcendence, offered something Rome never could: individual sovereignty rooted in faith rather than law. No longer was power imposed from above by emperors. It began to emerge from within, igniting a slow and painful metamorphosis. It's in this exact historical fracture that Western civilization finds its psychic wound. From its springs, both its greatness and its restlessness. Even today, we are still negotiating that break. You can see this transition reflected in modern shifts when the Soviet bloc fell or when the Berlin Wall came down. These weren't just political events. They were echoes of the same spiritual drama that played out in Rome: the death of one ideology and the painful birth of another. And we should ask ourselves, are we, right now, living through yet another turning of that cosmic wheel? One where the modern world order, built on secularism and science, starts to show cracks of its own? Every empire, Every dominant belief system reaches its apex only to tumble down the same hill it once climbed. The transition of orders isn't an exception, it's the rule. And in every fall, the same question rises like smoke from the ruins. What comes next? Because when one god dies, another waits in the shadows. And it's in that shadow that the conflict between paganism and Christianity first erupted. Chapter 2. The conflict between Christianity and paganism. In the ancient streets of Rome, marble statues of Jupiter and Mars once watched over men in armor. Paganism, after all, wasn't just a collection of myths. It was a complete worldview, a sacred justification for empire. The gods of Olympus were conquerors, embodiments of strength, virility, and order through domination. The Roman military mirrored that theology with brutal clarity. Yet in the catacombs beneath the empire's foundations, another fire was being lit, quiet, invisible but relentless. Christianity emerged like a whisper against the roar of the empire, but its power lay in its refusal to echo that roar. Christianity was subversive. It turned the very logic of power inside out. Where Rome celebrated the hero on the battlefield, Christianity raised the image of a tortured man on a cross and called him the Son of God. That reversal shocked the system. It introduced a moral revolution. Suddenly, humility was greater than glory, sacrifice nobler than conquest. For the Roman world, this was heresy, but for the human heart, tired of empire's cold grip, it was liberation. Faith no longer bowed to the emperor, it bowed to the unseen. And that's exactly why the clash was so violent. Paganism was flesh and blood, deeply tied to the rituals of the state, the army, and the household. Christianity was incorporeal, transcendent, and increasingly personal. It didn't just threaten Roman religion, it threatened the Roman way of being. Pagan temples fell not only because they were toppled, but because their gods stopped answering the cries of a people drowning in moral exhaustion. As bread and circuses lost their luster, men began to hunger for something the empire couldn't give. Imagine that today. Imagine someone walking into a boardroom or political summit and saying that power means nothing unless it's in service to love. That's the type of spiritual revolution Christianity seeded. And yet, as with all revolutions, it wasn't pure. It would eventually grow into its own empire. But in this early conflict, its essence was untamed, disruptive, alive. It whispered to the individual, "You are more than your empire says you are." A dangerous idea then, and still dangerous now. But even in victory, no revolution is final. Just as Christianity overcame the pagan order, another force would rise to challenge the Christian one, not through swords or temples, but through the promise of equality, material justice, and liberation from the very God who once liberated Rome. This time, the figure wasn't nailed to a cross, but crouching behind ideology, cloaked in reason, and speaking in the name of the people. That figure would come to be known by another name, the Antichrist. Chapter 3. The Role of the Antichrist. The Antichrist isn't some horned figure lurking in a horror film. It's far more cunning than that. It's an idea, a force, a reversal. If Christ was the symbol of transcendence, sacrifice, and spiritual truth, then the Antichrist emerges wherever those values are hollowed out and inverted. It doesn't need to oppose Christianity outright. It only needs to replace the spirit with form, the truth with ideology, the divine with the purely material. You can see it operating in history not as a man, but as momentum. It's the spirit of the empire returning, not with pagan gods this time, but with slogans and revolutions. Throughout Western civilization, the Antichrist spirit shows up disguised as salvation. Take communism, a vision of perfect justice that, paradoxically, required total control and mass violence to achieve it. Or fascism, the cult of order built on human sacrifice and deified leaders. These aren't simply political events, they are spiritual inversions. Each promised heaven on earth while turning earth into hell. The Antichrist isn't a monster in the shadows. It's the dream of utopia that demands you crucify your soul to get there. Nietzsche sensed it before most. He declared God is dead, not to celebrate, but to warn. When Christianity's spiritual fire cooled into moral bureaucracy, when it became more law than love, it left a vacuum. Into that vacuum rushed ideologies, each claiming to replace the sacred with the scientific, the transcendent with the social. But without logos, without the invisible thread that holds meaning together, even the most rational systems eventually spiral into madness. The Antichrist doesn't kill with chaos. It kills with too much order. This is why faith matters, not as blind obedience, but as the safeguard of meaning. Without it, the world becomes a machine, and you, just another gear. That's the ultimate temptation, to trade the mystery of the soul for the security of the system. The Antichrist doesn't need you to worship evil. It just needs you to forget the divine. Once you do, anything can be justified. Anything becomes possible. And that's when revolutions eat their own. Still, even in the darkest inversion, the presence of the Antichrist implies something else. That Christ is still echoing in the background, waiting to be remembered. Every false light reveals the need for true illumination. And that brings us back to the empire, where the line between order and oppression first blurred, and where the military arm of the Roman machine taught the world how to keep peace through dominance. Chapter 4. Empire and Military Order. The Roman Empire didn't rule the world through poetry. It ruled through precision, discipline, and fear. The Roman military wasn't just a fighting force. It was a living structure, a hierarchy of power designed to impose order across continents. Roads, laws, taxes, these were all downstream from the legions. If the sword didn't cut, nothing else followed. The genius of Rome wasn't merely in its strategy, it was in how it fused military logic with political ideology. The empire wasn't just built on conquest, it was conquest. But empires aren't sustained by victory alone. They're sustained by belief. The Roman soldier didn't just serve the emperor. He served the gods, the fatherland, the eternal city. This is where paganism and empire danced their tightest waltz. The divine was enlisted to legitimize expansion, and war was framed as a sacred duty. To rebel wasn't just a political crime, it was spiritual treason. And for a long time that system worked. Until it didn't. Because no amount of steel can protect a soul already corroded from within. History shows that every empire begins to rot when its ideology no longer inspires sacrifice. When duty turns into doubt and glory into bureaucracy, the sword grows heavy in the soldier's hand. That's exactly what happened as Christianity spread. Soldiers began to convert. Citizens questioned the gods. The empire still had its armies, but it had lost its will. Rome didn't fall to barbarians. It fell to a spiritual shift that made its very foundations obsolete. And yet, the spirit of the empire didn't die with Rome. It just changed uniforms. You can see it in the rise of colonial powers, in the industrial militarization of the modern world, in nations that worship order above truth. The legacy of Rome lives on whenever security is prized above freedom, whenever conformity is enforced with guns and flags. And the tragedy is this. Many people prefer the predictability of the empire to the uncertainty of spiritual freedom. But once Christianity had broken the Roman mold, it was free to reshape Western civilization. Not with legions, but with ideas. The spiritual outlasted the imperial, and soon new forms of governance would rise, crowned not by Caesar, but by the cross. And for a time, monarchs would rule not merely by blood, but by divine right, a right rooted not in conquest, but in Christ. Chapter 5. Christianity and its impact on Western civilization. When Christianity emerged from the ashes of the Roman Empire, it didn't just offer new beliefs. It proposed a whole new way of organizing the world. Power, once anchored in the sword, began to be claimed in the name of the cross. Monarchs weren't just rulers. They were custodians of a divine mission. The idea of the divine right of kings wasn't simply a political tactic. It was a spiritual reframing of authority. And that shift altered the very blueprint of Western civilization. Morality began to mean something different. Not what preserved order, but what aligned with God's law. This spiritual shift reshaped every layer of society. Law codes, once modeled after Roman civic order, were now rewritten in light of biblical values. Justice wasn't about empire anymore. It was about divine justice. Mercy became a virtue. Forgiveness, once a sign of weakness, turned into moral strength. Even the concept of time changed. History was no longer a cycle of rise and fall, but a linear journey toward salvation. It's hard to overstate just how deeply Christianity rewired the Western psyche. And yet, this wasn't a utopia. The church became powerful, and like all powerful institutions, it faced temptation. Over time, the purity of spiritual revolution hardened into hierarchy. The same faith that liberated souls from Roman bondage began to mirror the imperial systems it had once defied. Crusades, inquisitions, corruption, these weren't betrayals of Christianity alone, but symptoms of what happens when spiritual truth is welded too tightly to worldly power. When faith becomes empire, the gospel becomes policy. Still, despite its contradictions, Christianity offered something enduring, the concept of human dignity, that every soul, regardless of rank or wealth, bore the image of God. This seed, planted deep, would grow into ideas we now take for granted: human rights, charity, the sanctity of life. You want to see its legacy? Look at the abolitionist movement. Look at hospitals, orphanages, and the belief that suffering should be alleviated, not exploited. These didn't come from Caesar. They came from Christ. But no civilization stays fixed. As time passed, the spiritual authority of Christian monarchies began to weaken. New ideas stirred. Radical, intoxicating, dangerous. Thinkers began to challenge the throne, the church, the very notion of inherited power. The age of divine right gave way to the age of revolution. And soon, the Christian crown would tumble, replaced not by another king, but by the masses. Chapter 6. The End of Christian Monarchy and the Rise of Modern Ideologies. It began with a whisper and ended in a roar. The collapse of the Christian monarchy wasn't sudden, but it was seismic. For centuries, kings ruled with crosses in one hand and scepters in the other. But the Enlightenment cracked the spell. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Locke questioned the old order, daring to ask whether authority truly came from heaven, or whether it could be built on reason, liberty, and equality. These weren't just academic musings. They were ideological grenades tossed at the thrones of Europe. Then came the French Revolution, a turning point so violent it burned centuries of tradition in a single generation. Heads rolled, churches were desecrated, and suddenly, The idea of divine right looked absurd. In its place rose modern ideologies, democracy, republicanism, nationalism. At first, it felt like liberation. But chaos is the midwife of ideology. When monarchs fall, people don't just want freedom. They crave meaning. And into that void rushed new belief systems, each promising a better world, each demanding absolute allegiance. Communism, for instance, rose not merely as an economic theory, but as a replacement gospel. Marx's vision was profoundly eschatological, a future paradise on earth, achieved through class struggle and historical necessity. It promised what Christianity once had: salvation, brotherhood, a world without suffering. But this time, God was dead, and the state would be Messiah. Other movements followed suit. From fascism to liberal capitalism, ideologies became the new religions of the secular age, complete with martyrs, prophets, and heretics. And yet, something essential was lost in the transition. The soul no longer stood at the center of civilization, statistics did. The modern world began organizing itself not around spiritual truths, but around data, economics, and statecraft. Christianity had once taught that each individual was sacred, infused with divine value. Modern ideologies saw people as masses, demographics, voters, or labor units. This depersonalization created a spiritual vacuum, and that vacuum echoed through every revolution, every policy, every utopian blueprint that forgot the heart. But ideologies, like empires, are mortal. They rise on promises and collapse under their contradictions. The modern world, for all its progress, began to feel spiritually bankrupt. And as people grew disillusioned with both monarchy and ideology, another force rose to take center stage, one that promised tangible rewards, scientific clarity, and total control over nature: the spirit of materialism and secularism. Chapter 7: Materialism and the Rise of Secularism. Once spiritual foundations were uprooted, something had to fill the gap, and that something was matter, not just in the scientific sense, but as an ideology: materialism. The world was no longer a divine mystery. It was a machine. Souls became psyches, prayers became policies, and salvation was replaced by comfort, convenience, and consumption. Secularism rose not as a rejection of religion, but as a new religion itself, worshiping at the altars of logic, economics, and technological progress. And at first, it worked. Miracles were replaced by medicine, cathedrals by laboratories. But something subtle began to decay. Without a transcendent axis, values lost their center. Moral clarity turned into moral relativism. The sacred became subjective. What mattered wasn't what was true, but what worked. In this new materialistic logic, ideologies like communism emerged with renewed force, reframing justice as equality of possessions rather than dignity of being. It wasn't just redistribution of wealth. It was a complete reduction of human identity to labor, class, and productivity. The soul had no currency in this new economy. And while capitalism may seem the polar opposite of communism, both share a similar flaw. They frame man as a consumer, either of goods or of rights. The spiritual dimension is stripped, and meaning becomes transactional. Your worth? Measured in productivity. Your truth? Subject to trends. The tragedy of secularism is not in its rejection of the supernatural, but in its failure to replace it with anything nourishing. People don't just need purpose, they need ultimate purpose. And when that's gone, existential crises become the norm, not the exception. Look around. Depression is a pandemic, not because we lack pleasures, but because we lack presence. We've gained the world and lost the wonder. And while modern systems offer endless entertainment, they can't answer the oldest human questions. Why am I here? What is good? What does it mean to suffer well? These aren't technical questions, they're spiritual ones. And in a materialist paradigm, they're not just ignored, they're invalid. Still, humanity's hunger for meaning never dies. When the idols of the marketplace fail, people turn elsewhere. They seek answers in ancient texts, in mystical traditions, in dreams that defy the cold equations of science. But science isn't the enemy, it's the next arena. Because when stripped of arrogance, science doesn't destroy faith, it tests it. And in that testing, something new can emerge, a synthesis or perhaps a reckoning. Chapter 8. The Role of Science in the Modern World. Science was once a humble explorer, asking questions of the cosmos with awe and reverence. But somewhere along the way, it became an empire of its own, armed not with swords, but with equations and algorithms. It began to redefine reality itself, pruning out anything it couldn't measure. In doing so, it offered a powerful but limited lens, one that could split atoms but not mend hearts. As science expanded, it began to challenge the old spiritual orders, especially Christianity, and a new narrative took hold, one in which the material was real and the mystical was myth. At first, the tension was creative. Thinkers like Kepler, Newton, and even Pascal navigated both worlds, faith and reason, as complementary forces. But over time, the scientific worldview hardened into scientism, the belief that only empirical knowledge is valid. That's when the divide became a chasm. The soul became superstition, consciousness a byproduct of neurons, and the universe a cold accident. Yet, this framework, while useful for predicting phenomena, left people spiritually starved. You can have all the data in the world and still not know who you are. Modern science excels at describing the how, but it stumbles at the why. It can map the brain, but not explain the meaning of a thought. It can measure time, but not the weight of memory. And so, people began to look elsewhere, not because science failed, but because it stopped asking the right questions. This is where the conflict lies, not between truth and belief, but between different kinds of truth. Metaphysical truth doesn't contradict science, it transcends it. Interestingly, quantum physics reopened doors that Newtonian science had shut. Concepts like uncertainty, entanglement, and the observer effect hint at a universe far stranger and more conscious than previously thought. These aren't fringe ideas anymore. They're challenging the very bedrock of materialism. Even leading physicists now speak of reality as a projection, consciousness as foundational. In this context, ancient spiritual insights no longer seem naive, they seem prophetic. Still, for this dialogue to matter, humility is essential. Both religion and science must shed their dogmas. One must let go of rigidity, the other of reductionism, because the future of Western civilization may well depend on this reconciliation. We're approaching a threshold, a moment when the human spirit must decide whether to keep fragmenting reality or to reintegrate it. And in that decision, the question emerges, where is this all leading? What kind of world are we becoming? And is it still ours? Chapter 9. The Future of Western Civilization. We are standing at a crossroads, one paved by centuries of empire, revolution, faith, and ideology. Western civilization, once the carrier of Christianity's soul and Rome's order, now drifts in a sea of secularism, anxious about its future, yet unsure how to turn back. The institutions are still here, but the animating spirit seems lost. People scroll more than they pray. Meaning is outsourced to markets. The old gods are gone, and the new ones, progress, profit, popularity, feel increasingly hollow. And still, something stirs beneath the surface. In times of crisis, civilizations don't just break. They reveal what they truly worship. Right now, the West is facing a spiritual drought masked as political chaos. That's not just a theory, it's a pattern. When the soul is exiled, something else takes its place. Some see a new spiritual awakening on the horizon. Others fear the rise of an Antichrist figure. Not necessarily a person, but a system, an ideology, a collective abandonment of everything Christ stood for. And most dangerous part? It might come dressed in light, offering comfort, progress, even peace. But there's another possibility, a return, not to the past, but to the eternal. A generation disillusioned with both capitalism and communism, science and dogma, might just rediscover the value of the soul. Not through religion as institution, but as inner experience. Not through empire, but through individual sovereignty. The same Christianity that once overthrew the Roman order might quietly begin to rebloom, not in cathedrals, but in hearts seeking truth beyond screens. After all, the Logos never truly dies. It just waits. And maybe that's the secret. This isn't about returning to Christian monarchies or medieval orders. It's about recovering the vertical axis of meaning in a world obsessed with horizontal distractions. It's about remembering that history is not a straight line toward progress, but a spiral, a pattern where the same archetypes return, dressed in new clothes. The Antichrist rises when Christ is forgotten. The empire returns when freedom is feared. But so too does the sacred return when truth is desired again. So where are we headed? Toward transhumanism or transcendence? Toward a technocratic utopia or a reawakening of the soul? The choice, as always, lies not with governments or ideologies, but with individuals. Because the future of Western civilization is not just a geopolitical question, it's a spiritual one. And maybe, just maybe, this transition from Pisces to Aquarius isn't a collapse, but a call. Conclusion. So now the veil has been lifted. You've seen how civilizations don't just rise and fall, they transform. You've traced the ancient path from empire to cross, from revolution to ideology, from logos to algorithm. The real question isn't what happened, but what you're going to do about it. Will you keep surrendering your mind to systems that don't serve your soul? Or will you reclaim your spiritual sovereignty and begin thinking, feeling, and living like someone who remembers that eternity didn't disappear? It just got buried under distraction. Let this be your turning point, not just intellectually, but existentially. Start asking yourself, where do my beliefs come from? Who benefits from my forgetfulness? What am I sacrificing on the altar of convenience, comfort, or conformity? If this video stirred something in you, don't brush it off. Read Jung's Aion. Revisit the Gospels, not to obey, but to understand. Dive into Nietzsche, not to agree, but to wake up. Question the systems, but above all, question yourself. That's where all great revolutions begin. And if you're ready to walk that path, not the path of answers, but of meaning, then this channel is your companion. Subscribe, hit the bell, and join the few who still care about truth in a world drunk on illusion. And before you go, tell me in the comments, do you feel like we're witnessing the rise of the Antichrist or the return of the sacred?